Thank you so much for being with us this morning as we continue in our series in which we're going through Kings and Chronicles and trying to look at these stories in a way that impact our lives today, gleaning lessons from them, not only about certain things that God was doing in the Old Testament, but also looking to the ways in which these stories set the context for the coming of Jesus, set the context for the faith that we have and the faith that is given to us through Jesus by what he did on our behalf. And so, it's always important to remember that when we talk about what the gospel is, the good news is it includes the entire story of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Is the context of the good news. And so we're so blessed to have our Bibles that we can continually look to. And with that being said, we're going to look at a couple of stories from Elisha's prophetic ministry that are unique and they're interesting. And there's certain points in these stories where you might even cringe a little bit because the content that we're going to be looking at is kind of disturbing at times. And I think that's the appropriate response, right? The way in which Elisha is ministering to Israel in a time of distress shouldn't be missed. We should try to feel that distress. We should try to feel that discomfort. We should try to feel that corruption, which is very much present in some of the passages that we're going to look at this morning. But we're going to begin with a unique and interesting story, the axe head floats from chapter 6. Verses 1 through 7, and this kind of serves as the context for the main story that we're going to look at this morning. So if you have your Bibles, 2 Kings chapter 6, starting in verse 1. It says, "The company of the prophets said to Elisha, 'Look, the place where we meet with you is too small for us. Let us go to the Jordan, where each of us can get a pole, and let us build a place there for us to meet.' And he said, 'Go.' Then one of them said, 'Won't you please come with your servants?' 'I will,' Elisha replied. And then he went with them. They went to the Jordan and began to cut down trees. As one of them was cutting down a tree, the iron axe head fell into the water. 'Oh no, my lord,' he cried. 'It was borrowed.' The man of God asked, 'Where did it fall?' When he showed him the place, Elisha cut a stick and he threw it there, and he made the iron float. 'Lift it out,' he said. And the man reached out his hand and he took it, right? Interesting story, right? Interesting story that on its surface may seem kind of trivial, may seem like a unique time for Elisha to choose to use this power that's been granted to him, right? Mark has been, talking about that transition from Elijah to Elisha and talked about the fact that, Elisha is one of the more prolific miracle workers in the Bible. I believe he noted last week that only Moses has more miracles attributed to him in the Old Testament, right? But this seems like a strange way to use this miraculous ability, this God-given ability on behalf of others. But I think as we dive a little bit deeper, maybe we'll begin to see the purpose of this particular incident. And so if we were to look here at what they're doing, they're trying to build a place. And depending on your translation, the word may be used there, reside, or maybe dwell, or in the NIV, which we read, says a place where we meet with you. This whole, kind of idea here is a little bit disputed. Some scholars think it's a permanent residential structure, right? That maybe they're building a home, or maybe they're building a place where these prophets were living in community, but nevertheless it's too small. However, it's also possible to understand this verb to imply some non-residential meeting place that had become too small, right? So maybe it's just a gathering area or somewhere that they've come together to do business or to discuss maybe their role as prophets or what they're trying to do for the people of Israel. We're not exactly sure. The text may or may not imply some sort of communal living arrangements for the prophets. In any case, Elisha concurs that it's acceptable to build a larger facility, and the group cuts timber near the Jordan where trees could readily grow because of the moisture in the soil. Christopher Ralston and Heather Parker. And so, Elisha has, green-lighted this project. He's blessed it. He's even come to help them accomplish this project. And they go to this place by the Jordan where they're set up to indeed build a bigger dwelling, whether that's a residential or non-residential dwelling. It doesn't seem to be the main point of the story. But it does seem to set up this environment of the prophets wanting to be with each other. And if we were to go back to 1 Kings, and if we look at some of the turmoil that Elijah was feeling, some of the loneliness that he was feeling, and the ultimate encouragement that he got in 1 Kings 18 from Obadiah, when Obadiah says, "Haven't you heard, my Lord, what I did while Jezebel was killing the prophets of the Lord? I hid 100 of the Lord's prophets in 2 caves, 50 in each, and supplied them with food and water," right? This was a huge encouragement to Elijah and ultimately gave him the courage, to go confront Ahab because Obadiah had taken care of the Lord's prophets. He put them in these 2 different communities for protection. And so it seems like these prophets, whether they're some of the same ones or new prophets, the prophets have chosen to stick together. Maybe that's for encouragement, maybe it's for collaboration. We're not exactly sure, but there seems to be a sense of community among those who have been called to do prophetic work for the Lord. And so, what is the meaning or purpose of the miracle of the axe head? Well, there's a couple of possible ways to view this story. The first has to deal with the axe head itself, right? Peter Leithart notes that iron is a rare commodity in ancient Israel, so that losing an axe head might lead to significant debt. If he cannot pay, the debtor might have to enter into debt slavery until he can restore the cost of the borrowed item, right? So this is one idea that it could, not only put the person who lost the axe head into financial straits that were difficult, or maybe even into this concept of some type of debt slavery. I'm not sure that, that's the best reading of the text, but it is one of the explanations that's out there, this idea that it is really a financial rescue that is occurring. And so some of the context that might help us understand why this, might have been deemed such a dire financial circumstance. If we go back to 1 Samuel chapter 13, it kind of speaks to, how rare iron was and the ability to fashion iron was during that period of time. 1 Samuel 13, 19 through 21 says, "Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, 'Otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears.' So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plow points, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. And the price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening plow points and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes and for repointing goads." And so, earlier on we see that, due to some, it seems like military strategy, this craft, this job of blacksmith, wasn't something that was happening for a period of time in Israel. And so this might have contributed to this context of, iron being rare, or the ability to, manipulate iron for various purposes might not have been a very widespread thing. And so due to, this low supply, then maybe the cost continued to rise. So that's a perspective. And so from this perspective, Elisha's miracle is no trivial demonstration of power. In recovering the axe head, he delivers the man from indebtedness, potentially slavery, as he delivers the widow earlier. He is acting as a redeemer, restoring life and property to those who follow him. Elisha's instruction to take it up in 6:7 echoes his instruction to the Shunammite woman to take up her son, suggesting that by saving the axe head, Elisha gives the man new life. So that's an interpretation of this passage, this idea that he is redeeming the man from a terrible situation, that he is continuing his work as those who point people to God by rescuing them from trouble. And so a perspective could be that this is about the rescue of a person in need, and it's centered on the borrower. Another perspective, again, centered in the context, the setup of the narrative is a decision to build a house, which requires securing lumber from the Jordan and cutting down the trees. The axe head fell off the axe, a mishap It's common enough, right, when working with an axe. The loss of the axe head means that the entire project is hampered. The response to the one who lost the axe head is a characteristic utterance in deep time of distress. Alas, it is most remarkable that the distress expressed not over the impediment to the project, but that the damaged tool is a borrowed tool. That note suggests an intensely self-conscious moral community that is especially attentive to neighbor rights or the commitment to being in community. So maybe the focus is not as much on the borrower's potential financial straits, but maybe it's on how that responsibility is felt by the one who lost the axe head, how the borrower felt that his neighbor's tool, which he had borrowed, which he made a commitment to take care of, was now lost. And so maybe the story is about concern for neighbor. Maybe it's about the lender, or I think you could read it as something that Elisha is doing on behalf of the borrower and maybe on behalf of the lender as well. But there's also kind of a third reading which takes less of a specific look at the circumstances and tries to put it within the broader context of Elisha's prophetic role and the response to his prophetic role. This is from Walter Brueggemann as well. It says, the brief narrative proceeds according to a standard trouble rescue pattern. We may be especially impressed with the terseness of the account and with the acceptance of the wonder wrought by Elisha as a routine activity that does not evoke any particular curiosity or amazement. It is merely business as usual for the prophet, right? It seems straightforward. He's able to make this axe head float. And the other prophets that are there, the other people who are part of this community, they don't seem to be wowed or in wonder by Elisha's action. It just seems par for the course. Given that, we should not miss the extraordinary claim made for Elisha in such ordinary rhetoric. This is the man of God, filled with the spirit of Elijah and the power of Yahweh, who yet again enacts what may be routine in this circle, but that everywhere else is judged impossible, right? So for those who were close to Elijah, they might have viewed this as a routine occurrence, but more than anything, it's an affirmation of the special role that Elisha is to play among the people. He is the one who has received the spirit of Elijah, but more than that, he's the one who has been called by Yahweh to act on his behalf to the people. And so this story, for sure is an affirmation of Elisha's prophetic role and task and standing among the people. And so we see that, this story kind of, speaks to those in need, speaks to the caring for others, and speaks to Elisha's prophetic role, which is very much going to be on display in our next set of texts, which encompass the rest of chapter 6 and chapter 7. It's this interaction with the Arameans. And so it begins with this story from 6:8 to verse 23 about Elisha trapping the blinded Arameans. And so we're going to read this text and then discuss it. It says, now the king of Aram was at war with Israel. After conferring with his officers, he said, I will set up camp in such and such a place. I think that's kind of funny, right? He's going to set up camp somewhere specific. The man of God sent word to the king of Israel, beware of passing that place, because the Arameans are going down there. And so the king of Israel checked on the place indicated by the man of God, and time and again Elisha warned the king so that he was on his guard in such places. And this enraged the king of Aram. He summoned his officers and he demanded of them, tell me, which of us is on the side of the king of Israel? None of us, my lord the king, said one of his officers, but Elisha the prophet who is in Israel tells the king of Israel the very words you speak in your bedroom. Go find out where he is, the king ordered, so I can send men and capture him. And the report came back that he is in Dothan. And then he sent horses and chariots and a strong force there. And they went by night, and they surrounded the city. When the servant of the man of God got up and went out early in the next morning, an army with horses and chariots had surrounded the city. Oh, no, my lord, what shall we do? The servant asked. Don't be afraid, the prophet answered. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And Elisha prayed, open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see. And then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked, and he saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. As the enemy came down toward him, Elisha prayed to the Lord, "Strike this army with blindness." And so he struck them with blindness as Elisha had asked. Elisha told them, "This is not the road to the city. Follow me, and I will lead you to the man you are looking for." And he led them to Samaria. After they entered the city, Elisha said, "Lord, open the eyes of these men so they can see." And then the Lord opened their eyes, and they looked, and there they were inside Samaria. When the king of Israel saw them, he asked Elisha, "Shall I kill them, my father? Shall I kill them?" "Do not kill them," he answered. "Would you kill those you have captured with your own sword or bow? Set food and water before them, so that they may eat and drink, and then go back to their master." And so he prepared a great feast for them. And after they had finished eating and drinking, he sent them away, and they returned to their master. And so the bands from Aram stopped raiding Israel's territory. And so we see this multi-layered story of both rescue and redemption, right? And that seems to be the theme that we're looking at, rescue and redemption by God through Elisha, or in conjunction with Elisha. And so we see that, this context, this conflict with Syria or Aram, is something that happens a lot. And it's mentioned in 1 Kings 22 that this conflict occurred in the time of Ahab, and it seems to have resumed. There is perennial conflict between the two states, so that the narrative can pick up the account of hostility at any time. This narrative identifies neither the king of Aram nor the king of Israel. So we can fix the report historically only by literary context. Clearly, Elisha, and neither king, is the key character in the story. The narrative may be divided up into three parts: the pursuit of the spy, the decisive and peculiar action of Elisha, and the happy consequence of the prophetic activity. And so those are the three kind of core sections of this piece of the story as identified there by Brueggemann. And so we see that this king of Aram is upset. And what makes him upset? Well, his plans are getting spoiled, right? He's set up specific plans. He's going to be in such and such a place, and he's doing so strategically for the purpose of raiding Israel, right? For the purpose of engaging in conflict with Israel, and yet his plans keep getting spoiled over and over again to the point where they are upset, and they don't know where this information is coming from. The king of Aram knows that somebody's putting it out there, and so his advisors tell him that Elisha is revealing this information. The information to the king of Israel with the dubious hyperbole, right? It may be a real thing that the king has said in his bedroom. Maybe he actually gave the information about where to be in his bedroom, or maybe it is this hyperbole that Elisha knows even the words that you speak in your bedchamber, right? And that's meant to evoke a lot of things, right? That's supposed to be a private place. It's threatening to think that somebody who's not in your room knows what's being said in your room, right? That's a disconcerting thought. And so the king, here he's upset. He's upset that not only has his privacy been violated, not only has his kingly status as the one who is supposed to help render these military victories, not only is it being upended, but it's being upended, through the prophetic task of Elisha, right? Through the prophetic, giftedness of Elisha. He is knowing what the king is not wanting anyone from Israel to know. And so, the story is not really worried about the specifics of how Elisha is able to do this. We're not told how the prophet manages such access, and characteristically, the narrative expresses no interest in the question, right? That might be our first question. Hey, God, how is Elisha able to do this? Or, hey, Elisha, how does this work? But the story is not really concerned with those specifics. This odd form of knowledge is a given of prophetic inscrutability, suggesting that the hidden ways of Yahweh endlessly subvert human power and human planning, right? God has a way of working that is beyond human understanding, and that often gets in the way of human plans, often gets in the way of human strategy, often gets in the way of even the most carefully planned out things. And we're about to see this even more on display that Yahweh is working in the world on behalf of his people in manners that we don't always see, and we definitely don't always understand. And so the king, is ready to send the people. In verse 13 of 6, they're going after Elisha. The king says, "Go find out where he is so I can send men and capture him." And the report came back that he is in Dothan. And so they sent horses and chariots and a strong force there. They went by night and surrounded the city. And then we see that Elisha has a servant, and he has the right reaction, right? In the morning, he wakes up, he sees all of this movement of troops and materials, and the fact that they're outnumbered, they don't know what to do, and so he comes to Elisha, and he is afraid, and so Elisha asks God to do something special. And that special thing is giving him the ability to see what is truly happening around them. The servant gains prophetic sight so that he now sees what was invisible to him in his cowardly common sense. What he now sees is that the mountains and the hills all around Samaria are occupied with horses and chariots of fire. That is, the arms and weapons of a luminous quality that lie outside of conventional weapons. The servant is granted a vision of trans-historical reality. The servant can now see what conventional discernment misses in its self-assured blindness. Either way, the prophet's count of allies and enemies is validated, and his fear not is grounded in reality. The allies of the prophet and the servant massively outnumber those of Syria, right? So this fear not admonition given by Elisha to his servant, saying everything's going to be okay, is affirmed when the servant is given the special ability to see what's actually happening. And he sees, this different type of warrior, this warrior that is aligned with he and Elisha by the virtue of the fact that they're aligned with Yahweh, right? And so we see, God there protecting, God there ready to fight on behalf of his people. And this is indeed a common theme in the Old Testament, this idea of Yahweh as warrior, right? The word here, and I'm sure I'll probably mess up the pronunciation, but it's Yahweh Seboeth, and it literally means the Yahweh of armies, from Christopher Ralston and Heather Parker tell us here. So we know that, the reference here is to the God, who fights, the God who fights on behalf of his people, the God who is there for his people. And we have so many illustrations of this in Scripture. We're going to look at just a couple of them. This is from Exodus 15, verses 2 through 6. This is the song that is sung after the crossing of the Red Sea. It says, "The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has hurled into the sea. The best of Pharaoh's officers are drowned in the Red Sea. The deep waters have covered them. They sank to the depths like a stone. Your right hand, Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, Lord, has shattered the enemy," right? You see that phrase there? The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name, right? This is from Joshua chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. We have this interaction between Joshua and someone from the Lord's army, right? This interesting interaction here in Joshua 5. It says, "Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and he saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went up to him and he asked, 'Are you for us or are you for our enemies?'" Right? Some boldness there for Joshua. "Are you for us or are you for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." How about that to have on your business card, right? Commander of the army of the Lord, and he's here. Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence, and he asked him, "What message does the Lord have for his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so, right? And so we see over and over that one of the roles that God plays on behalf of his people is that of warrior, is that of protector, is that of the one who fights on their behalf. And so we see this sight extended to the servant, but we're about to see the sight removed from the enemies of God, and the enemies here of Elisha and the servant. Verse 18 tells us, as the enemy came down toward him, Elisha prayed to the Lord, strike this army with blindness. And so he struck them with blindness as Elisha asked. And so we see this change, right? We see this change from sight given to the one who is aligned with God, and sight taken away from those who are not aligned with God. Brueggemann puts it this way: this is what happens after this. Elisha leads the impotent Syrian troops into Samaria blind, where he prays a third time, this time to permit the Syrians to see the sorry situation in which they have landed. To be inside Samaria means that they are captives at the mercy of Samaria's king, right? So this is where the king of Israel is. They've been blinded. Elisha and his servant lead this group of would-be captors as those who are captured into the place of the king of Israel. And then they're restored of their sight, right? How scary would that have been, right? To have been led somewhere blind and then to have your eyes opened again and to see you're in the enemy's, stronghold, right? The place of the king. This is where you have been taken, right? And they would have assumed the worst, right? They would have assumed that bad things were going to happen to them because of where they had been taken. But yet we see a different response, right? The king wants to take them down, right? The king wants to kill these people. And he has this interaction with Elisha that seems to show respect, which is going to erode here in our next story. But he seems to show respect. He says, he calls him father. He's like, should I kill these people, right? Should I punish my enemies? And Elisha says, would you punish the enemies that you've taken by sword and bow? Which in one way the king might interpret as, oh yeah, right, I'm the tough king of Israel. Of course I'm going to do that. But that's not what Elisha is getting at, because that's not how he is meant to behave as the king of the people. And so we see here a remarkable reversal. This narrative is an account of a remarkable inversion, all accomplished by the prophet. At the center is the move of the servant from blindness to sight, complemented by the Syrian experience from sight to blindness to sight. A narrative pattern is wrapped around these core actions so that the larger move of the story is from hostility to peaceableness, right? So we've got this conflict, this raiding of Israel, this battle between Aram and between Israel, and yet we're about to see that all change due to the hospitality, the meal put before the captives. And so the key character around whom all this revolves is the prophet. He has in this narrative the authority to shape the future and is engaged in public activity that decisively impinges upon these larger policy questions, right? Whether we're going to be at war or not, whether we're going to kill the captives, whether we're going to, escalate this. He's telling them, no, we're going to take a different strategy towards our enemies here. And he is shown to have the authority unmatched by either king. He is, in this episode, a force for peace, right? In the midst of war, the prophet helps usher in peace. And so there is a ceasefire that results because of this action. And so, instead of all this, escalating, Elisha extends the hospitality of God to them in Samaria. And so we see that there is, for a time, a ceasing in the battle between the people of Aram and the people of Israel. But that doesn't seem to last too long. And so in 2 Kings 6, starting in verse 24, this picks up again. And we actually have the king of Aram named in this story. So sometime later, Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, mobilized his entire army, and they marched up and they laid siege to Samaria. So things are back at it. The war is back. Things have escalated, and they are going to enact a siege on the capital, on the place where the king of Israel is. And there was a great famine in the city, and the siege lasted so long that a donkey's head sold for 80 shekels of silver and a quarter of a cab of seed pods for 5 shekels. As the king of Israel was passing by on the wall, a woman cried to him, "Help me, my lord the king." So we have this cry for help, and listen to the situation she's about to describe. The king replied, "If the Lord does not help you, where can I get help for you? From the threshing floor? From the winepress?" And then he asked her, "What's the matter?" She answered, "This woman said to me, 'Give me your son so that we may eat him today, and tomorrow we'll eat my son.' So we cooked my son, and we ate him. And the next day I said to her, 'Give up your son so we may eat him.' But she had hidden him." When the king heard the woman's words, he tore his robes. As he went along the wall, the people looked, and they saw that under his robes he had sackcloth on his body. And he said, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if the head of Elisha, son of Shaphat, remains on his shoulders today." Now Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were with him. And the king sent a messenger ahead, but before he arrived, Elisha said to the elders, "Don't you see how this murderer is sending someone to cut off my head? Look, the messenger comes. Shut the door and hold it shut against him. Is not the sound of his master's footsteps behind him?" And while he was still talking to them, the messenger came down to him. And the king said, "This disaster is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?" Elisha replied, "Hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Lord says. About this time tomorrow, a seah of the finest flour will sell for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." And the officer on whose arm the king was leaning said to the man of God, "Look, even if the Lord should open the floodgates of heaven, could this happen?" "You will see it with your own eyes," answered Elisha, "but you will not eat any of it." And so we are in dire, dire straits. Bad things are happening as a result of this siege. And we're going to dive into just the desperation, but also the lack of leadership. And really, the comparison between how God is working through Elisha and how the king has become so disconnected from God that he is blaming the Lord for what is happening in this moment and blaming Elisha as the prophet of the Lord as well. So the truce accomplished by Elisha with the feast, right? This truce is created by an abundance of food, right? In verse 23, did not hold. Hostility between Israel and Syria or Aram was old and well established and persisted long past any peacemaking effort on Elisha's part. This extended, complicated narrative tells of the resumption of war and its wretchedness, of the duplicities required by war. The siege sounds like an all-out war effort, a primary consequence of which is famine. The war-induced famine is the defining factor for the narrative that follows, and that's from Walter Brueggemann as well. And so we have this picture of this strategic effort to cut off the flow of resources, to cut off the flow of food, and to create this famine for the people who are in the city. And, we in our, area of abundance, we don't see starvation often, right? If we were to really try to put ourselves in this text and, because, if this was just a room and we were in person and it was only adults, we might even pull up some pictures of those who are starving. But that's not what we're going to do, since this is streaming into people's homes and, not sure who would see them. But that's almost what we have to do to get ourselves in that place, is to see what famine does, to see the effects of a body that is starving from lack of food, right? This is at the core of the fight for survival. The people don't have what they need. They don't have the sustenance. And so it causes them to act in ways that they would have never dreamed of acting, right? To act in ways that go beyond human decency, that go beyond our ability to conceive what could ever make someone behave that particular way. Marvin Sweeney puts it this way, that famine provides the backdrop for the portrayal of the desperate plight of an ancient city under siege. The ability to withstand siege depends on the ability to wait longer than the attacking forces, right? They are in a holding pattern. They are in a time of desperation, and they're in need of a leader, right? They're in need of a king to hold things together because it has gotten bad. They're in need of someone to show the type of leadership that, is able to withstand this military siege, and they don't have it. And so we see that the siege has lasted so long that a donkey's head sold for 80 shekels of silver and a quarter of a cab of seed pods for 5 shekels, right? And I don't have the economic comparison there, but we can assume that that is very inflated, right? We can assume that that is ridiculous prices because food is so scarce. And so he mentions that, and that would have meant something to the earliest of readers. But what we see here is this distinction seemingly between what's going on in the city and what's going on for the king. In the midst of this war, the prospect that we are to make class distinctions in the cost of war is between those who enact war in the royal house and those who suffer war in the lesser places are made clear in these verses, right? There seems to be this big separation between what's being experienced by the common people and what's being experienced by the king, right? He seems to be tone deaf in many ways to what's going on around him, and we see it in his callous response to the woman, right? He's on the wall, and the woman cries to him, "Help me, Lord the King," right? She is desperate, but she has already passed over the place of desperation, right? She has entered into something unimaginable. But the king's response is, "If the Lord does not help you, where can I get help for you? From the threshing floor, from the winepress?" And then he asks her, right? At first he's like, "How in the world can I help you?" Right? "Where am I supposed to get stuff from you?" Right? The stuff's not there. How am I going to help you? If God hasn't helped you, how am I, the king, going to help you? Before he ever asks her, what is the matter? And then she tells this just terrible, terrible story, right? We see here that cannibalism is practiced. The woman seeking justice against the other woman, her case is horrific, as her complaint is that the other woman has backed away from her promise to kill her son so the two of them can consume him, right? It says they've already consumed one of the children. This is despicable. This is, about as worse of a situation as could be imagined, right? It says here in 29, they cooked the son and ate him, right? This should make us upset. This should make us cringe still as we read it, right? There is no proper response to the situation except for outrage, right? This is desperation in its truest sense. And so the king does respond, but he doesn't respond as a wise king would, right? He blame shifts, right? He begins to try to paint a different narrative. And as terrible as this story is, for the people who are hearing it retold and who are, knowing what a king should do, they're probably hearkening back to a story that is not the same, but has some similarities, and that's an interaction with a king who was granted wisdom from the Lord, and that was King Solomon. And so let's look back at this story about these two prostitutes who came to King Solomon, and they stood before him. And one of them said, "Pardon me, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I had a baby while she was there with me. The third day after my child was born, this woman also had a baby. We were alone. There was no one in the house but the two of us. During the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him. So she got up in the middle of the night and she took my son from the side while I, your servant, was asleep. And she put him by her breast, and she put her dead son by my breast. And the next morning I got up to nurse my son, and he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning light, I saw that it wasn't the son that I had born." The other woman said, "No, the living one is my son, and the dead one is yours." But the first one insisted, "No, the dead one is yours, and the living one is mine." And so they argued before the king. And the king said, "This one says, 'My son is alive, and your son is dead,' while the other one says, 'No, your son is dead, and mine is alive.' And then the king said, 'Bring me a sword.' And so they brought the sword for the king. And he gave an order, 'Cut the living child in two and give half to one and half to the other.' And the woman whose son was alive was deeply moved out of the love for her son, and she said to the king, 'Please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him.' But the other said, 'Neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in two.' And then the king gave this ruling, 'Give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is his mother.' When all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice." Right? And so here, similar, terrible situation, right? A terrible situation of loss, terrible situation of dishonesty, terrible situation of two mothers, pit against each other in front of the king. And yet the king rules in a way that his ruling, made an impact, and that his ruling showed that he had the wisdom to administer justice. But what does this king do? When the king heard the woman's words, he tore his robe, he went along the wall, and as the people looked, they saw that under his robes he had sackcloth. But here's the shift, right? He gets in a posture of mourning, seems to be responding appropriately with outrage, with mourning, but he shifts. And he said, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if the head of Elisha, son of Shaphat, remains on his shoulders today." And so he shifts gears. He wants to execute the prophet, the one who spoke on behalf of the Lord, instead of taking culpability and responsibility for the situation that he had helped create through his poor leadership. And so we're going to see the words that Elisha spoke to the king and to his servant come true as the siege is lifted. And so this is our last text for this morning. We'll read it together, 2 Kings 7, 3 through 20. We see here another reversal of fortune between those who are less fortunate and those who are considered the most fortunate. It says, "Now there were 4 men with leprosy at the entrance of the city gate. They said to each other, 'Why stay here until we die?'" Right? The lepers have reached the point of desperation as well. "If we say we'll go into the city, the famine is there and we will die. If we stay here, we will die." This is how desperate they were. They said, "So let's go over to the camp of the Arameans and we'll surrender. If they spare us, we live. If they kill us, then we die." At dusk, they got up and they went to the camp of the Arameans. When they reached the edge of the camp, no one was there, for the Lord had caused the Arameans to hear the sounds of chariots and horses and a great army, so that they said to one another, "Look, the king of Israel has hired the Hittite and the Egyptian kings to attack us." So they got up and they fled in the dusk, and they abandoned their tents and their horses and donkeys. They left the camp as it was, and they ran for their lives. The men who had leprosy reached the edge of the camp, and they entered one of the tents, and they ate and they drank. Then they took the silver and the gold and the clothes, and they went off and they hid them. They returned and they entered another tent, and then they took some of the things from it and they hid them also. And then they said to each other, "What are we doing? This is not right. This is a day of good news, and we are keeping it to ourselves. If we wait until daylight, punishment will overtake us. So let's go at once and let's report this to the royal palace." And so they went and they called out to the city gatekeepers, and they told them, "We went into the Aramean camp, and there was no one there, not a sound of anyone, only tethered horses and donkeys and tents just left as they were." And the gatekeepers shouted the news, and it was reported within the palace. And the king got up in the night, and he said to his officers, "I will tell you what the Arameans have done to us. They know we're starving, and so they have left the camp to hide in the countryside, thinking that we will surely come out, and then we will take them alive and get into the city." One of his officers answered, "Have some men take 5 of the horses that are left in the city, and their plight will be like that of all the Israelites left here. Yes, will only be like all these Israelites who are doomed. So let us send them to find out what happened." So they selected 2 chariots with their horses, and the king sent them after the Aramean army. And he commanded the drivers, "Go and find out what has happened." And then they followed them as far as the Jordan, and they found the whole road strewn with the clothing and equipment the Arameans had thrown away in their headlong flight. So the messengers returned, and they reported to the king. And then these people went out, and they plundered the camp of the Arameans. So a seah of the finest flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley were sold for a shekel, as the Lord had said. Then the people went out, and they plundered the camp of the Arameans. And so a seah of the finest flour sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley sold for a shekel, as the Lord said. Now the king had put the officer on whose arm he had leaned in charge of the gate, and the people trampled him in the gateway, and he died, just as the man of God had foretold when the king came down to his house. It happened as the man of God had said. About this time, a seah of the finest flour will sell for a shekel, and 2 seahs of the barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria. The officer had said to the man of God, "Look, even if the Lord should open the floodgates of heaven, could this happen?" And the man of God replied, "You will see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat any of it." And that is exactly what happened to him. For the people trampled him in the gateway, and he died. And so we see this radical reversal. The people who are the outcasts, the lepers, they're the first to experience the spoils of the army that the Lord has run off, the army that the Lord has dispelled and that have been dispatched, right? They have left. And the lepers experience the spoils, and they've been cast out, right? They're the outcast. But yet, even in the midst of experiencing the blessings, they go, hey, this is not good for us not to go back and tell the people. They're the ones with conscience. They're the ones with a responsibility for neighbor. They're the ones who care about the other, which the king does not, right? The king is even convinced that this is a trap, right? And he has to be convinced to send people out to even check. And he assumes he's sending them and they will never come back because they're going to experience the doom of the trap. But yet it's the word of the Lord that is made true that has been spoken of by Elisha. And so we see here, in contrast to the king who represents the apex of that society, the narrative portrays the lepers as the ones who finally discover that the Arameans have abandoned their siege, whereas the king was completely unaware the Arameans have fled and refuses to believe they have left even after he is informed of the eyewitnesses. And so we see here, in the state of desperation, in the state of everything that they're at, the king still has no belief in the Lord. And so we see Elisha, speaking on the Lord's behalf, being faithful to his calling, and serving as a part of the way that God rescued his people. So what does this have to do with the axe head? Well, it seems like it's all one connected narrative, that the people who are with the Lord, they care about the people who see themselves in desperation, whether it's true desperation, like being in siege under the city, or it's the desperation of losing something of importance. It's the desperation of feeling like you have, mistreated your neighbor, or you have not been faithful to your neighbor, right? God is faithful to his people, and God desires for his people to be faithful to each other. And yet we see a prophet who does this and a king who does not, right? The role of the prophet is often to serve as an extension of God and to provide the moral compass that his people need when they've gone off course. And that's the role that we see Elisha playing in these stories. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. I know we went through a lot of text, but I hope you were blessed by seeing by reading about the God that we serve. We'll be back in 2 Kings next week. So thank you so much for joining us.